Hi, everyone. My name is Samantha Hill. I'm the Assistant Director of the Hannah Arendt Center. Welcome to this week's virtual reading group. Can everyone hear me and see me okay? Good. Susan's nodding. Thank you, Connell. Okay. So, Bob, I see you're wearing the Thinking Without Banister yellow. It's you've dressed in good spirit for our discussion today. So,
My
we're
my
going to
daughter, who
be
grew up
talking
on
about
Sesame Street, called the book The Big Bard.
the Nice. It is a book full of yes, I was gonna try and make a pun, but I'm not gonna do it. So today we are going to be talking about three essays, really just one though, in the new edited volume, Thinking Without a Banister. Um, a very short piece, 2.5 pages. Hannah Arendt wrote after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, Kennedy and After, a book review of the works of Nathalie Sarraute. I probably am pronouncing that wrong. And then a rather famous interview that she gave in 1964, and this volume has been titled As If Speaking to a Brick Wall, a conversation with Joachim Fest. So the real bulk of our reading today is the interview that Arendt did with Joachim Fest. I'm going to just talk for a little bit and kind of walk through some of the key things that she's talking about in the interview and go over some of the passages. But she gave this interview in 64 when she was in Germany, a year after she published Eichmann in Jerusalem in 1963. And this interview is an example of Arendt addressing the controversy that unfolded around the publication of Eichmann. And Fest asks her a series of questions addressing some of the key issues of disagreement that were raised in the public discourse that followed. So in this interview, Arendt offers us almost a definition of what she meant by the banality of evil. And this is probably the clearest statement that we have summing up what it was she was after when she coined the phrase and what it is that she was struck by when she encountered Eichmann at the trial in Jerusalem. She continued to think about the question of evil throughout her life. The problem of evil and the question of evil is a question that is very old to political philosophy, and it's a question that played an important role in Arendt's thinking about the emergence of totalitarianism in the 20th century. She moves, of course, I think we've talked about in other discussion groups when we did Origins last year, from an idea of radical evil to the concept of the banality of evil. And she's asking how it is and why it is that individuals act in certain ways that fundamentally violate the nature of the human condition, the condition of plurality. And so let's take a look at the passage on page 278. I'm going to jump around to just draw out the key themes that she's talking about. On page 278, she says, Fest asks her, you've already indicated that the way we imagine evil, or the way evil is imagined, has been formulated in our culture, in religious, philosophical, and literary terms, has no place for the type of man like Eichmann. One of the main ideas in your book already emerges in your subtitle, is the banality of evil. This has led to many misunderstandings. Yes, look here, she says. These misunderstandings actually run through the whole polemic. They belong to the small part of it that is genuine. In other words, it's my view that these misunderstandings would have arisen in any case. Somehow it shocked people enormously, and I can understand that perfectly well. I myself was very shocked by it too. For me too, it was something for which I was quite unprepared. And she's making a claim here about the argument that she's making in Eichmann about the banality of evil, which is to say that she saw something of a truth that she had to report, even though it was shocking to her, and she knew that it was going to be shocking to other people. Later on, Fest asks her how she negotiates the tension between deciding to tell a truth that you know is going to be upsetting and how you attend to when you hurt other people's feelings in making arguments. And she felt a responsibility to report what it is that she experienced when she encountered Eichmann face to face. And then so in the next paragraph, we get this kind of definition. Now, one misunderstanding is this. People thought that what is banal is also commonplace, but I thought that wasn't what I meant. I didn't in the least mean that there's an Eichmann in all of us, that each of us has an Eichmann inside him and the devil knows what's else. Far from it. I can perfectly well imagine talking to somebody who says to me something I've never heard before. So it's not in the least commonplace. And I say, that's really banal, or that's just rubbish. That's the sense in which I mean it. This banality was a phenomenon that really couldn't be overlooked. The phenomenon expressed itself in those unimaginable cliches and turns of phrase that we heard over and over again. I can tell you what I mean by banality, since in Jerusalem I remembered a story that Ernst Jünger once told, and I've forgotten. And I want to actually go through that next paragraph, but to pause for a second here, this is echoing a key part of Eichmann in Jerusalem. And just for people who are following along with the conversation, I know a lot of us have read Eichmann in Jerusalem, but just to take a step back for a second, one of the arguments that Arendt makes in Eichmann is about his unthinkingness, right? He called himself, a bureaucrat. He was proud of his participation in the Nazi regime. He was a functionary cog. She's going to talk about bureaucracy in this interview a little bit. But Eichmann was unable to take a step back from the position he played in the regime to think about the actions that he was engaging in. And when he was asked to address the horror of his crimes, he could only come up with a series of cliched responses. And the most damning example Arendt gives of this in Eichmann towards the end is when he's on the gallows and going to be hanged. And he's given the opportunity to give last words, and he offers a speech. And it's the kind of speech one would imagine in like a very overly narrativized Hollywood drama. He gave the speech that he thought he was supposed to give instead of finding a way to speak for himself and from his own place of thinking. So she says in this next paragraph, she unfolds it a bit more. She says, during the war, Ernst Jünger came across some peasants in Pomerania or Mecklenburg. No, I think it was Pomerania. The story is told in Strahlungen Radiations, the title of Jünger's collected diaries from the Second World War, which was published in 1949. A peasant had taken in Russian prisoners of war straight from the camps, and naturally they were starving. You know how Russian prisoners of war were treated here. And he says to Jünger, well, they're subhuman, and like cattle. It's easy to see they eat the pig's food. Jünger comments on this story. It's sometimes as if the German people were being ridden by the devil. And he didn't mean anything demonic by that. Look here, there's something outrageously stupid about this story, Arendt says. I mean, the story itself is stupid. The man doesn't see that this is what starving people do, that anyone would behave like that. Still, there's something outrageous about this stupidity. Eichmann was rather intelligent, but in this respect he was stupid. It was his thick-headedness that was so outrageous, as if speaking to a brick wall. And that was what I actually meant by banality. There's nothing deep about it, nothing demonic. There's simply resistance ever to imagine what another person is experiencing. Isn't that true? So, if we were going to maybe from this interview try and think about banality in one sentence, we could say banality is that feeling we get that we're talking to a brick wall when we're trying to have a conversation with someone, to get them to think outside of the constant stream of pre-formed responses and answers and cliches. And I think we've all experienced that kind of sensation in political conversation time and again. But there's another claim embedded in this idea of talking to a brick wall. And it's tied to Arendt's conception of thinking, right? So on the other side of the banality of evil, right, is this claim on thinking as an activity that we can engage in. And she's drawing this idea of to imagine what another person is experiencing from her reading of Kant and from her reading of Kant on judgment, who says that we have to go visiting in order to expand our imaginations. So I want to come back to bureaucracy and responsibility. But so Arendt kind of takes apart, Fest asks her about Eichmann citing Kant. And to her, this is kind of laughable because Kant's categorical imperative insists that we think from the viewpoint of everyone else. And in his terms, the only good is a good will, right? So Kantian judgment demands a good will. But for Kant, this goodwill meant that we had to be able to imagine what another person is experiencing, right? So it's not a kind of purification of the will in the sense that Eichmann tried to claim it that he was acting from a good place of heart, right? Which is a radical misreading of Kant. But Arendt is saying actually what Kant is talking about is being able to imagine how other people are experiencing the world. And I just want to add a parenthetical here that maybe we can come back to in conversation, that this is not the same thing as empathy and the way that we might be inclined to talk about empathy in politics today. It's not to imagine the feelings of another, but to, through a kind of rational thinking process, engage in an act of imagination to think about what another person is experiencing. It's not a claim on being able to know how another person is experiencing the world in any kind of moralistic sense. So I want to slide back up and then think about that in relationship to this question that gets raised in the interview about Eichmann's obedience and personal responsibility. So she talks about the question of Eichmann's obedience and the role that bureaucracy played in the organizational structure of the death camps. And on page 275, toward the very beginning of the essay, Fest asks Arendt if these trials have shed light on a new kind of criminal. Right? And she says it is indeed a new type of criminal. I agree with you on that, though I'd like to qualify it. When we think of a criminal, we imagine someone with criminal motives. And when we look at Eichmann, he doesn't actually have any criminal motives. Not what is usually understood by criminal motives. He wanted to go along with the rest. He wanted to say we. And his going along with the rest and wanting to say we were quite enough to make the greatest of all crimes possible. The Hitlers, after all, really aren't the ones who are typical in this kind of situation. They lack power without the support of others. And this is an important move that she's making here at the beginning of the essay, thinking about the relationship between bureaucracy and personal responsibility. that's going to tie into the way she's understanding the role of these trials in Germany and what it is that they're doing. So she ties this idea to her conception of power. The idea that power can only be found when we act together in concert with one another. That power is not something that arises when we act alone. So in the next paragraph, she says, so what's actually going on here? I'd like to concentrate just on Eichmann, since I know his case well. The first thing I'd like to say is that going along with the rest, Eichmann's mentality, that kind of going along, which involves lots of people acting together, produces power. So long as you are alone, you are always without power, regardless of how strong you are. This feeling of power that arises from acting together is absolutely not bad in itself, but altogether human. Right? That doesn't mean it's good. It's simply neutral. It's something that's simply a phenomena, a general phenomena that needs to be described as such. In this way of acting, there's an extreme feeling of pleasure. I won't start quoting reams of material here. You could go on quoting examples from the American Revolution for hours at a time. Now I'd say that the real perversion of this form of acting is functioning. So there's a perversion of action, right? That's happening here in this movement mentality and Eichmann's mentality of going along with this functioning. And in functioning, the feeling of pleasure is also always there, right? Eichmann got a lot of pleasure from what he did. One of the reasons he was caught in Argentina was because he bragged about what he had done in Nazi Germany and the elite position that he had had in the regime. And during the trial, in the next couple of pages, Arendt says that, one of the reasons Eichmann got pleasure from what it was he was doing was because he felt like he had a difficult job. And when we feel like, we're really making a contribution to something that's difficult, we get pleasure from that participation, right? What you have here, though, she says, yet everything else in acting together with others, namely discussing things together, reaching certain decisions, accepting responsibility, thinking about what we are doing, is all eliminated in functioning, right? So we have two different kinds of action that she's teasing out in these paragraphs. One is the familiar conception of action where we can act together collectively in concert, which is productive of political power. And that involves acting with others, discussing things together, reaching decisions through our discussions together, accepting responsibility for our actions, and stopping and thinking what it is we are doing, right? And those key characteristics of political action are erased when action is reduced to a kind of functionary activity, what she calls empty busyness. And she says the pleasure in this empty functioning was quite evident in Eichmann. Did he seek pleasure and power? I don't think so. He was a typical functionary. And a functionary who is nothing but a functionary is really a very dangerous gentleman. Ideology, I believe, in my view, played no great role here. That seems to me decisive, right? And so she sees Eichmann as this removed functionary who was fundamentally incapable of engaging in thinking in the way that she conceptualizes thinking in this text and comes back to it at the end. So on page 282, jumping a bit forward then, Arendt wants to think about how it is that we ascribe responsibility to individuals. So within a bureaucratic system, responsibility does not easily fall upon one person because that's the nature of the way bureaucracy is organized. But when people are drawn into a courtroom and put before a judge, then they are confronted with their individual actions within the bureaucracy. And this is one of the functions that Arendt sees these trials performing. So she says in the paragraph at the bottom here on 282, look here, we put people on trial, we ascribe responsibility to them, and we have a right to do so from a legal standpoint. We have the right since the alternative was not martyrdom. There was an alternative on both sides. You didn't have to go along. You can make up your own mind. Thanks anyway, bud. I'm not going to do that. I'm not risking my life. I'm not trying to get away. I'm trying to see if I can slip off. Isn't that right? I'm not going along with anyone. And if I should be forced to go along, then I'll take my own life. This possibility existed. Right? I mean, that's a very stark claim that she's making there, right? That sometimes the only possibility of not going along with, of refusing that mentality of joining, is suicide. Okay? The possibility existed. It meant not saying we, but I, judging for oneself. And judging for oneself is what people did everywhere at every level of the populace, religious people, non-religious people, old, young, educated, uneducated, nobles, bourgeois, and a great many workers, an amazing number of workers in Berlin, where I was able to watch it happening. Okay. And then I want to skip over to page 284, okay, where she says, we need to realize that in totalitarian circumstances, the phenomena of powerlessness exists. And we need to realize that even in circumstances of absolute powerlessness, there are still different ways of behaving, right? And so even under the conditions of totalitarianism, under the conditions of atomization, when the private and social public realms of life have collapsed in upon one another, when it appears as if we have no possible way of moving otherwise, there still exists in powerlessness a question of personal responsibility and how one takes responsibility for oneself. In other words, it doesn't imply that you absolutely have to be a criminal. The phenomena of powerlessness tips the scales, and this was the situation of all these people. They had become absolutely powerless. There was no possibility of resisting since they were all isolated, since they did not belong together anywhere, since not even a dozen people could get together, as it were, and trust one another. Right? And here she ties this back into thinking. So how is it that we can take responsibility for ourselves as individuals in conditions when we have no power? The proposition comes from Socrates, right? She returns to Socrates whenever she talks about thinking. He's the pivotal figure for her. But Fest says, would you say, Frau Arendt, that as regards the situation, we can get by with the old proposition that it's better to suffer injustice than to commit it? This is one of the fundamental precepts of Plato. The idea that it's better to suffer injustice than to cause injustice. It's better to suffer harm than to cause harm to others. In other essays, she says that this proposition has been lost. But she says, look here, this comes from Socrates. In other words, it was formulated before the religious commandments for Christian and Western mankind, taken from the Jews, became authoritative. When Socrates always added, or rather Plato did, is that we can't prove this proposition. For some people it's self-evident, but you can't prove to other people that it's how they should behave. So what is the reason for the belief of those who view it as self-evident? Now there's another proposition of Socrates, which in my view does provide us with the reason. And this is the claim against the banality of evil that she's staking in her conception of thinking, and why it is that we don't go along with, and why it is that we resist and take personal responsibility. It is better to be out of harmony with the whole world than with oneself, since I am one. For if I am not in harmony with myself, a conflict arises that is unbearable. In other words, it's the idea of contradiction in the moral realm. which is still authoritative for Kant's categorical imperative. This idea presupposes that, in actual fact, I live with myself and am, so to speak, two in one. I live with myself, so that I then can say, I will not do this or that. For then the only way out, if I do this or that, is suicide. Or latter, when thought in Christian categories, to change my mind and repent. Okay, why? Right? Living with yourself means, of course, talking to yourself. Living with yourself means talking to yourself. And this talking to yourself is basically thinking. A kind of thinking that isn't technical and of which anybody is capable. So the presupposition behind the idea is, I can converse with myself. And so there may be situations in which I fall out of harmony with the world to such an extent that I can only have recourse to myself, and perhaps with a friend too, with another self, as Aristotle so beautifully put it, alas autos. This, in my view, is what powerlessness actually is. And some people who walked away without doing anything admitted to themselves that they were powerless and clung to this proposition, the proposition that someone who is powerless can still think. So even in conditions of absolute powerlessness, in the conditions of totalitarianism, regardless of one's position or role, one can still engage in the thinking activity. The idea that we converse with ourselves, that at the end of the day we go home and we have a conversation with ourselves, that we are our own thinking partners, is a kind of radical claim. In an essay that we read on responsibility under moral dictatorship together last winter, Arendt talks about this example further, and she gives the example of murder and whether or not as individuals we decide to commit murder. So why don't we kill other people? We don't kill other people because it's bad to kill other people. That's not that the moral categories of good and bad don't hold up to judge the act of murder. We don't kill other people because if I go out this afternoon and kill someone, then I have to spend the rest of my life living with a murderer. And the conversation that I have with myself can never be harmonious. That I will be forced to spend my life in conversation with somebody who has committed this horrible act, right? So I just want to jump to the next page on page 286, and then I'll stop talking for a bit. So Arendt then ties the question of bureaucracy towards the end of the essay more directly to this conception of thinking. And she says towards the top, the bureaucracy, in other words, administered mass murder, which naturally created a sense of anonymity, as in any bureaucracy. The individual person is extinguished. As soon as the person concerned appears in front of the judge, he becomes a human being again, right? So Eichmann claimed that he never actually killed anyone, right? Which may or may not be true, but that is beside the point. Claiming a position in a bureaucracy is not an erasure of one's individuality, right? And so in this sense, appearing before a court, a judge, to be judged for one's actions transforms the person into an individual again, whereas bureaucracy tries to erase the individual person. And this is actually what is so splendid about the legal system. A real transformation takes place. For if the person then says, but I was just a bureaucrat, the judge can say, you listen now, that's not why you're here. You're standing here because you are a human being and because you did certain things. And there's something splendid about this transformation. Apart from the fact that bureaucracy is essentially anonymous, any relentless activity allows responsibility to evaporate. And here we get one of the fundamental axioms that underpins so much of Arendt's writing, and that ends the introduction to the human condition. There's an English idiom, stop and think. Nobody can think unless he stops. In another essay on thinking, she goes back to Socrates, to one of the similes used to describe Socrates is that of the stingray. He paralyzes his interlocutors into a kind of stunned position so that they're literally forced to stop and engage in dialogue with him. If you force someone into remorseless activity, or if he allows himself to be forced, then you will always hear the same story. You'll always find that an awareness of responsibility can't develop. It can only happen in the moment when a person reflects, not on himself, but on what he's doing. Okay, so I am going to stop there. I see there are a number of questions and have some that were sent in. So I have a question from Howard that was sent in advance, and I'm going to read your question, Howard. Is that okay? Good. So Howard says, in this month's reading, Arendt deals with the issue of obedience. Yes, she places a limit of obedience at an inner voice that questions the humanity of the actor. I would say that questions the actions of the actor in terms of this essay. But she identifies this inner voice as thinking, inner dialogue. It's not just an inner voice. I'm gonna talk through your question. It's an inner dialogue, the two-in-one conversation. And she says, however, she never probes the origin of that voice. She does a little bit in the book on thinking. I don't know if we've done the thinking book in our discussion group. It's a very philosophically thick volume. It's actually one of my favorites of Arendt. But she does there talk a little bit more about the character quality of the voices in the two-in-one conversation. She gives examples of René Char and Franz Kafka and Socrates. And she talks about the kind of biohistorical narrative sense of self that we have, which is our kind of ego I. She calls it the ego, right? I position, the I'm Sam, and my experiences in the world shape me. And when I go home at the end of the day and I think, then all of those experiences are a part of my thoughts. The plurality of the world is a part of the thinking exercise. And the other voice, and one way she draws it out is, so that would be conscience, and then the other would be a self-consciousness, our ability to step back from that immediacy of self and to critically reflect upon ourselves and our activities and actions in the world, which is what echoes what she's saying here in that sense. So I can say a lot more about that if we want to talk about that. And then you bring up, oh dear, Foucault. Interestingly, Foucault, in early 1978, after Arendt's death, his final lectures, I think they were, gave several lectures in which he identifies the biopower of obedience, tracing it back to early Christianity, yes, and the confessional, and shows how it can overpower thinking. Thinking that Arendt took as basic. He shows how obedience can demand conformity for its own sake. So perhaps we did not understand Eichmann's defense. And you put in brackets, I'm not a Nazi sympathizer, far from it. I didn't think you were. Perhaps he was like the insane criminal defendant, mentally incapable of acting otherwise. He's not banal, he's impaired, not by nature, but by power structures. I think we have to take Arendt deeper and probe these power structures as resultant societal mechanisms. So Arendt is not a Foucauldian, neither am I, but you're using Foucault to critique Arendt is pretty consistent with what Foucault talks about in those final lectures on obedience. He teases out a conception of obedience which is essentially post-structural, which is to say that obedience breeds obedience, and that obedience is bred in us through religious rituals, like participating in the confessional, which consistently requires that we admit our sins to a confessor so that we can receive redemption. And that these kinds of confessional activities make us into obedient subjects. Arendt is making more of a phenomenological claim, whereas Nietzsche's claim is socially constructed about how obedience comes into being through power and knowledge accesses that shape subjects and the way that they think about the world. Arendt is making a kind of, I think, more penetrating claim about the human condition and our ability to think as individuals. She does not forsake the idea of the individual for the subject. So that might be one way to kind of parse it out. So for Foucault, we're subjects, which are shaped by social and political power structures, and it's always about power. Whereas for Arendt, we are individuals who have a sense of self-authority and are able to retain a sense of fidelity to self outside of power structures. Does that make sense, Howard? Do you want to add something? I see you smiling at me. I can't hear you again. Your microphone is still broken. I'm sorry. If you want to chat, if you want to put it in the chat box, then I can read it. I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Can anyone else hear Howard? No, okay. I'm sorry. I don't know what just can someone just turn on their mic and say hi so I can make sure I can hear other people?
Hi, this
Hello.
is Kim.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I can hear you. Kim, do you want to add something to that, or were you just helping me out?
No, I was just helping you.
Thank you. All right, so Howard, if you want to type something to respond, I'm happy to read it in the chat box. Daphne writes, younger story so close to describing Trump. Nothing demonic but an unthinking brick wall. I read a quote by Marx quoting Hegel. History repeats itself. This is the first sentence of the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. History repeats itself. The first time as tragedy, the second time as farce. One of the, I'm not sure, I don't think I put a sticky note on it, but one of the, I can find it. One of the things that Arendt draws out in this essay, or somebody else can help me find it, is the importance of humor and being able to laugh.
That's in the Sarraute.
It's in the Sarraute?
Yeah.
I drew them, but she mentions Sarraute in this essay. But you're right. That specific reference I'm making is
Sam?
yes.
It's on the very last page. The
273.
290.
Oh, on the 290.
At the top.
Yeah. Yes. There it is. So, but on the bottom of 289 to 290. This is actually, I think, a really interesting part of the essay and really relevant to a lot of the political conversations that we're having today. Did you want to add something, Rhea, before we read it? So Fest asks her this really interesting question, and she says it's the only question in the whole Eichmann controversy that interests her. And the question is, should we tell the truth even when we come into conflict with certain legitimate interest on the one hand and people's feelings on the other? Okay. And then she talks about the need for people to be guardians of factual truths, that is, for people to report on what it is that they experience. And then she talks about the question of feelings. And she says, there's no question about it. I have wounded people, And you know it's more unpleasant for me when I hurt people than when I get in the way of organizations and their interest. I take this seriously, I must say, while the other thing is only a matter of principle. While I have hurt these legitimate feelings, essentially through my style, primarily her use of irony, and I can't say much about that. I can't say much about that. I think that actually says a lot, right? She acknowledges that the style she chose to write Eichmann in Jerusalem in hurt, wounded people she was very close to, but that she had a sense of responsibility to report the facts as she saw them. Look here, it's my view that the legitimate feeling here is sorrow, the only one, not self-congratulation. And very few people understand this. There's nothing I can do about it. In fact, in my opinion, people shouldn't adopt a pathetic tone to talk about these things, since that only belittles them. But all of that, I also think that you must be able to laugh, since that's a form of legitimate sovereignty. And I understand that to mean legitimate self-sovereignty, to be able to laugh. And I feel that all these criticisms of my irony are very unpleasant indeed from the point of view of taste. But these are personal matters. I'm obviously rather unpleasant in the eyes of a great many people. I can't do anything about that. What am I supposed to do? They just don't like me. The style in which people express themselves, that's something they themselves are unaware of. This is actually, I think, a really nice, it's a nice way to end this interview, but it's also a really nice passage. It's so rare in Arendt's writing that she takes a step back in conversation to reflect upon her own person and her personal feelings or positions or thoughts about her work or the way her work is going to be received or how her disposition as an individual affects the way that she is thinking about the world. And I think here you get a really stark, a really strong portrait of her. Some people just don't like me, and that's okay. It's okay that some people don't like me because of the way that I express myself, because she insisted upon retaining that fierce sense of fidelity to oneself. And Daphna, I've strayed a bit from your question, but my point was in bringing it back to the text was simply to say that I think if I read what you've written correctly, I agree with you, and that it's good to find some humor in our contemporary political situation, especially when we consistently run into brick walls.
I would like to challenge the idea on Trump. I think
Okay.
he is radically evil.
You think
Domestically,
you think he's what, evil?
radically evil.
What, radically evil?
Yeah,
No.
domestically, he's trying to undo everything that Obama did. And internationally, he's trying to undo the Western alliance. He seems more driven by these negative purposes than he is by anything positive. He's a guy totally without friends, who has no ability to empathize. He only knows himself, and he will continue every day to shock us with something more terrible and negative that he's going to pursue.
I agree with the last sentence that he'll continue to shock us. I think that there are two different ways to think about Trump's presidency. Neither one is especially pleasing. The first is that in terms of the policies that he is passing and the kind of political program that he's maneuvering through the GOP is fairly consistent with a traditional Republican platform, except more conservative. And his presidency, in a lot of ways, in that sense, is not that startling. I would say any more so than Reagan's presidency was. But Trump, the person, and the way that he conducts his business, I think is remarkably destructive of the public sphere in a way that is going to have a lasting impact on our political institutions and our ability to engage in politics in the United States. And I think
I don't see him as a traditional Republican
he's
at
not
all.
he's not a traditional Republican, but he is advocating for public policies through the GOP, which is passing his public policies, tax cuts, tariffs.
Can I say something?
No, the GOP is traditionally anti-terror.
Can I just say something?
There are two voices, Daphne and Margaret.
I didn't
Daphne
mean
and then Margaret.
I didn't mean to turn this into a discussion on Trump, but it
Oh.
was it was.
I think Bob did that.
I really didn't. I just meant to say that it sounded just like him. He would totally not understand. He would totally not comprehend. And if he did, he would use it to further his own goals, whatever they may be. But I don't see him as smart enough to be demonically evil. That was all. But really, my question is, if history repeats itself, and this is not the first time, is it really farce? Because my concern is that this is a distortion that's so different from the first time that it could actually be tragedy again. That was really my point. So,
what do you mean by the first time, Daphne?
If we're repeating fascism, then the first time it was a tragedy, and this time it's farce with a balloon and diapers floating above London. Or is it really a lot worse than that? But I didn't mean it to be a discussion on Trump, so I'm really sorry.
No, that's okay. And we can come back to Trump at any time, unfortunately. But no, I mean, I would say that we're not repeating. I mean, the question that people keep asking is America becoming a fascist country? And no, the answer is America is not becoming a fascist country. There are certainly elements that Arendt identifies in the origins of totalitarianism, like the collapse between fiction and reality, and the political emancipation of private capital into the realm of politics, that helped pave the way to totalitarianism that I think we're experiencing today in different senses. But as I've said, I think in our discussion group before, the institutions of American politics are remarkably resilient. And I'm not sure that we're quite to that historical phase yet. Melissa says, like do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Kant. Are you asking about the categorical imperative, Melissa? I'm not sure if Melissa's there. Are the categorical yes, you typed yes. So for Kant, the categorical imperative stipulates that one's actions have to be able to be universal actions, so that we have to be able to act from a place of goodwill, so that our actions are good for all of humanity and not just for ourselves. And that should be the standard of judgment by which we act as individuals. So yes, the kind of do unto others as you would have do unto you is very resonant with Kant's conception of the categorical imperative in the way that Arendt is reading it in relationship to her discussion of Eichmann here. Daphne writes, in some societies to this day, I equals selfish, we equals humble as moral values. While I agree entirely with Arendt on thinking and personal responsibility, these societies are known to me and it is very hard to reconcile. Do you want to talk about what societies you're thinking about specifically? When I hear the I and the we, my first thought.
Well, the first three are countries.
Occupy or something like that.
Yeah. I lived for almost 20 years in Japan, and the whole idea of obedience and using yourself and putting yourself first is very selfish, it's considered rude, it's considered to be oblivious to the traditions and the enormity of other people's wise thinking. So it's a society that maybe is changing today, but certainly geared to obedience. The German society at the time of the Weimar was also a very traditionally obedient society. I don't know if the concept of I being very selfish and I will do this despite the rest of you who are telling me to do something else is quite the same as the moral implications. But then I also am from Israel, and in Israel, the idea of taking your own way as opposed to the way of the nation is considered totally immoral. There's something wrong about having this individualism, which is a Western concept, really, the individualism. So when you take personal responsibility against society, it's obviously, for my perspective, because I worship Arendt, very, very relevant. And I see, for example, I don't know how many of you saw the what is it, the trials yesterday with, what's his name? The guy, Strunk. When he took a stand, it was very impressive because he was going, he was going his own way. He was asserting something. But he also demonstrated enormous fidelity to an institution that's groupthink, just as religion is that. So, and I have another autobiographical element to share with you. My sister was a stenographer at the Eichmann Trial. So she actually sat there and typed it out. Yeah. And she's a lot older than I am, just to set the record. But I agree with the whole idea that there is an element here where Eichmann doesn't take personal responsibility because he didn't really ever develop his personal identity and his own thinking, as opposed maybe to the group. But there are societies in which doing that is considered such a different thing. It's considered.
Sure.
So it's hard to reconcile. I mean, there was a very famous hero in Israeli literature who said, "It's good to die for our country." Well, I'm not sure I agree with that, but that's a sentiment. So, and I think Arendt opposed this group thinking in Israel as well. She wrote quite a bit about that. Anyway, sorry for taking too much time.
No, that's fantastic. And it's it's a topic in this essay we haven't touched on yet. She says, I think she says it at some point in the book review that we read, that I can't remember if she's the word appalled at the kind of her seeming understanding of a German's desire for obedience within society. And so it is, I think, probably socially variant, but in this interview, there's a kind of, and throughout her work, there's this kind of play between the I and the we. The concept of plurality runs so deep in her writing. What makes us human, essentially, the way that she starts the human condition is that men and not man inhabit the earth and make the world together. So our fundamental condition of being human is one of plurality, is one of a collective. And then her concept of action evolves out of that we only have power when we act collectively in concert with one another. So to act in the world requires this plurality, requires a we. But at the same time, there's always this kind of, but you go home at the end of the day, right? And then it's just you. And you have to reckon with what it is how you have acted as an individual in the world. So even the conception of thinking, the two in one, contains both the we and the I, and I think a really important sense. In the book review before this essay, she talks about how I don't know how to properly say her last name. Someone can correct me. Sarraute. I have not read her writing, plays with the pronouns I and we and they in order to place responsibility and judgment on certain characters that she develops narratively in her text. So in one where she turns the idea of they around so that it doesn't signify the kind of alien other or that outside the self, but becomes the principal actor, and then vice versa. But I think it's a the question of the I and the we is really I'm trying to think of it actually if there's an essay that specifically addresses that throughout Arendt's writing. I can't think of one off the top of my head, but I will I'm gonna poke around. Bob, what did Arendt think of the inner migration, the idea proposed by some Germans who stayed behind, that they opposed the regime in their mind, if not in action? So there's a reference to that in this essay, which we can take a look at. It came slightly before, I think, the last passage that I read, on the bottom of page 285. So Fest says, let's get back to Eichmann and the role that bureaucracy played in mass murder. What does it mean for an individual to be embedded in a bureaucratic apparatus? And how far can the awareness of injustice evaporate? Is it maybe that the merely partial responsibility given to a person hides the possibilities for any moral insight? Eichmann said, I sat at my desk and I did my work. And for the former Gauleiter of Danzig stated that his official soul had been always identified with what he did, but his private soul had always opposed it. And then there's a footnote here to what Arendt's referring to from Jerome Kohn. And then Arendt says, yes, this is the so-called internal immigration among the murderers, which means the extinction of the whole concept of inner immigration or inner resistance. The extinction of the whole concept of inner immigration or inner resistance. I mean, there's no such thing. There's only external resistance. Inside, there's at best a reservatio mentalis, right? Those are the lies of a sham existence. Transparent and rather nauseating, right? So just to go back to one of the last things that we were talking about to answer your question, Bob, for Arendt, we engage in this two-in-one activity in the critical thinking Kantian sense that she's developing it, not so that we can become better thinkers who sit alone at our desks, but so that we can act in the world with a sense of integrity. And there's this kind of tension there then between acting and thinking. And so this kind of excuse of internal immigration or resistance, in that sense, I mean, she uses really harsh language here, and says, that this is a sham, right?
Does that contradict what she's saying about we always have a choice not to comply?
It doesn't. I don't think it contradicts it. I think that I'm not sure how it would contradict it.
Well, I'm not sure if it's in her work or that of some historians, but there's evidence that on both sides of the issue of compliance, sometimes German soldiers did not comply, and they were, taken out, and maybe their duty was changed, or they were sent somewhere else. And there are other instances where they were shot for disobeying orders.
Yep.
And so I'm just trying to understand what Arendt's concept of non-compliance would be. So
the activity of thinking does not become the activity of non-compliance. The activity of thinking is what allows us to not comply. So people like Eichmann, who were incapable of thinking, were happy to be functionaries in the bureaucratic machinery because he was unable to reckon with his actions or the consequences of his actions in any real way, to be able to, as she says at the beginning, to imagine the world from the perspective of any other person. This is one of the things that I think Arendt, gets criticized for in the controversy unfolding after the publication of Eichmann. But she says here in this essay, in terms of suicide, but in the Eichmann book, that, look, there are basically, I think she says, three options. You can resist and possibly be killed. You can commit suicide. I can't remember what the third one is off the top of my head. Somebody remembers it, they can tell me. But, or, be punished in some way, I think, to be expelled. But she says in a couple of places, the people who decide to do this, to engage in this activity, to not conform, to not go along with, to not be a joiner, to stand guard over the truth, since the time of Socrates, have often been sentenced to death for doing just that. That sometimes the cost of acting with integrity and with fidelity to oneself is death.
I was thinking
and
of
I
her,
think, yeah.
of her teachers. Did Jaspers stay in Germany or did he go to Switzerland?
I believe Jaspers stayed in Germany for a while, and I'm not sure. I would have to look that up. I can't remember that.
I think
Well,
so. I think he stayed in Germany until sometime after the war, and then
Yeah.
he was offered the teaching position in Switzerland.
Yeah. I think that's right, Susan. That's my instinct, but I don't factually have it in front of me, so I don't want to say for sure.
well, and I certainly don't mean to malign him. I'm just thinking of him as an example of somebody who took or had to take at some point the inner emigration, and compare that with somebody like Heidegger, who declined to defend himself, even though he remained quiet.
Yeah.
And so these might be two different instances
Yeah.
of an inner emigration.
Yeah.
I think Jaspers, he lost his position as a professor. He was in no way was he being participating. He was completely marginalized. He was not teaching, as opposed to Heidegger, who was promoted during the Nazis.
Yeah.
I also think that Jasper's wife was Jewish, so I think. So, and he lost quite a bit. I can't compare him negatively to Heidegger at all.
No. I don't think that I'm not sure the case of inner immigration in the sense that Arendt is describing it here applies to either. Definitely not to Heidegger, and I wouldn't venture that it applies to Jaspers either. Staying in Germany alone is not, a lot of people stayed in Germany and did a lot of political work trying to help people escape or to do other things. I don't think that Arendt is referring to just remaining in that sense. Howard wrote, "Thank you for your analysis, you're welcome, of the difference between the thinking of Arendt and Foucault. Your discussion was enlightening." Thank you, Howard. "I think that both perspectives need consideration." Absolutely. "While we are not powerless when confronted with power, we cannot ignore both its conscious and unconscious impact on our lives." While we are not powerless when confronted with power, yes, I agree with that in a certain sense, and yet at the same time, I am remarkably wary of the extent to which everything today is reduced to a question of power and power politics, because I think that's destructive of politics. And there's a great, actually Sheldon S. Wolin, a great political theorist of the 20th century, wrote 2 essays on Hannah Arendt. 1970s, and in one of them he says, critically of Foucault, holding him up against Arendt, that when you turn everything into, when everything becomes a question of power, then it erases politics. When everything becomes political in that sense, then nothing is political whatsoever. And Foucault, in that sense, is remarkably, I mean, you can't say this, but Foucault is remarkably anti-Arendtian because his understanding of power flattens all spheres of life into one question of power, and from which subjectivity emerges. So he does not retain the separation between private life and public life in the sense that Arendt demanded to protect the spheres of freedom. So I am somewhat sympathetic to Foucault, and yet very wary of the lasting impact he has had upon our contemporary politics. Melissa, yes. Wow, Daphne. I think responding to the biographical note. Equal wow, I want to hear more about that. Susan, Hannah Arendt's style, including use of irony and humor in her defense of herself by claiming misunderstanding because of her style. Isn't it possible that her banality thesis was inept? And that her use of words, including in this interview, which of course is an interview, you can listen to the interview by the way, online. If you put in Arendt and Fest, YouTube, 1964, there's an audio recording of the interview. It's in German though. So if you understand German, enjoy. If not, I'm sorry, I don't have subtitles. Including this interview, which of course is an interview, not an essay. Using words like comical, comedy, intellectual society, irony. I like that she uses the word stupid 3 times in this essay personally. So I was wondering if Hannah Arendt's thinking here is somewhat sloppy and her expression careless. I'm going to finish reading it. Hannah Arendt's supposed rejection of German essentialism, that Germans aren't especially brutal, but then she goes on to describe Germans as immature, younger stories typically German, this inability to think in place of the other, and the maniacal way, you found the quote, the maniacal way that obedience is idealized by Germans, which sounds pretty essentialist, especially since she doesn't see the individual subject as being socially constructed. So, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't think it's sloppy. I think that this is an interview that was given for a public German audience, and that she actually does a really nice job of addressing some of the key philosophical arguments she's constructing in Eichmann in Jerusalem in layman's terms so that they're presentable to a kind of, public audience. I think that's actually one of Arendt's great virtues as a writer. Her writing is available in a lot of ways to people like that. She, there are different forms of irony classically. There is a kind of insistence on humor and irony. And
I just think it's
insistence on humor and irony is part of what got her into so much trouble.
then
You
I
want to jump in?
yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. No, I just feel like with a topic like this,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I sort of bristle. I think there's some situations that are hard to joke about, and that her insistence on that and being light and being ironic, I think for many of us it undercuts. I like her attempt to explain what she meant here, but
Yeah.
I'm not totally convinced, I guess. I just somehow felt like she might have been able to make this argument in a way that would have caused less pain and maybe be clearer.
Well,
That's all. It's just
yeah, no, I think, it's a very valid point. You are not alone in making that point. Sholem made that argument when he publicly lambasted her. Adorno famously in the Dialectic of Enlightenment says that, you can't, Charlie Chaplin is not funny, right? Because you can't make light, the great dictator cannot be seen in a humorous manner. Because you can't make light of this, and that there can be no poetry after Auschwitz. He was very much against irony and humor and any kind of artistic representation of totalitarianism because he thought it undercut the seriousness and gravity of what had occurred. Arendt is not of that school. Irony is not levity. Irony is a rhetorical device that is used to, I think bring a kind of depth of understanding to the sometimes ridiculous, monstrous, unthinkable experiences of the world.
I think maybe Norman Finkelstein, have you heard him speak, Susan? You would be very upset by him, I think, because he attacks the whole concept of this is a unique Jewish experience, and he attacks people of today who still consider themselves victims. I think that Hannah Arendt was prescient because she was way before her time in attacking the Holocaustization, maybe, of the Israelis and the Jews in the world, including Shalom, I think.
Yeah. I mean, Arendt's position at the time was definitely outside of the mainstream attempts at understanding totalitarianism or to address Eichmann's trial. No. Do you want to add something else, Susan?
No, I guess I was just trying to do it. It's like on the one hand, I find her, most of her thinking and explanation compelling, but I do find myself at times I feel like, well, just more what I said, that there's just something a little inept, and it unnecessarily. That's to me, but I feel like, even in her defense, like, this is who I am. You like me, you don't like me. It's sort of like Trump saying they don't like me. Well, they don't like you for a reason.
Did you just compare Hannah Arendt to Donald Trump?
No, but only in no, that's not fair. But only in the sense of, saying some people just may not like me. Well, if you have some self-reflection, you might say, well, why is it they don't like me? And
So
then
some
I
people
think it's valid for
a
people.
kind of slippery. I get what you're saying, and I think that's a kind of slippery slope. And there's a certain brusqueness in Arendt's interview here.
Which in a way, in style, I appreciate. Yeah. But I also can't help feeling like sometimes it's a kind of defensiveness that may make it more difficult for some people to really grasp what she has to say, which is important. So it can be off-putting, let's put it that way.
Absolutely, and I think that she realized that, and she thought about it. And just because she was certainly made aware of the ways in which she had hurt people around her by writing the book in this way,
and misunderstood, perhaps.
And misunderstood. She was aware of it, but she thought that to write it any other way would have been a disservice to the truth.
Yeah.
And it was a decision that she made.
Yeah.
And she was brutally attacked for it. Brutally attacked for it.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, that's a recurrent conversation, and I know we can talk about for a long time.
I wanted to do something. Oh, can I bring up something about that when she says that she's not implying that everybody has an Eichmann inside of him?
Yeah.
I really wonder about that, because to me, that's exactly what that concept implies, is that it's banal, we're all functioning, we're all doing our little jobs, and we're all, watching TV to escape or whatever, and we're all, immunizing ourselves to the things that are going on every single day. So I guess, my original understanding of that phrase was that it was, the potential for that was very common.
Absolutely. And I think that's why she's responding to it in this interview in those terms, because that's how people read it and how people were writing about it in criticisms of the of her coverage of the trial. So there are several things that she's attacked for in the way that she writes Eichmann. And one is that the concept of the banality of evil somehow essentially implies that everyone is capable of engaging in this kind of monstrous activity. And Arendt is saying, actually, that's not quite what I meant by banal. I didn't mean commonplace or everydayness, which somehow, anesthetizes us to, thinking in that way, but banal in the sense that it's a reflection on her claim of thinking, of self-reflective, critical thinking. What exemplifies Eichmann's banality? The way that he spoke, the language that he used. The language that we use reveals the extent to which we're thinking about the world and our ability and capacity and facility to think and to judge for ourselves, and is also for Arendt. I think Leon Botstein is fond of saying that, Arendt used to say that Arendt would judge a person by like the words that she would use. I'm getting his quote wrong. But that the language we use is important for revealing the character of our person. And for Eichmann, his cliches and the repetition and inability to move past initial responses into any kind of thoughtful, reflective space upon his actions is what signified the banality for Arendt in that sense. I think when we hear banality, it does mean, this kind of the humdrum of everyday life, washing over us, and the coffee, the counting of coffee spoons in T.S. Eliot's parsing. But it's for Arendt, it's more a claim on how it is that we think and the expansiveness of our imagination. The idea of imagination and the way that she's conceptualizing the two-in-one thinking process is so important here. That's, what she's picking up out of Kant, and this idea that when we go out in the world and we act, that we're engaging in this, kind of wandering activity, which is expansive of our imaginary to think the world from the perspective of another. It's an essential embrace of the fundamental human condition of plurality in the way that she's conceptualizing it, which is the exact opposite of what totalitarianism does by collapsing the world so that we can't move anywhere, we can't wander anywhere. And so we become restricted in these ways, and the way that bureaucracy also takes the individual person out of the computation of activity, and all are one. That it undermines our ability to think critically, for Arendt.
Can I jump in?
Who's that? Margaret. Yes, please.
This is something that, I have trouble with this throughout this interview that she gave, and some of the other writings as well, which is it just seems as if there's a presumption of result if one engages in thinking as she defines it, and or if one doesn't. And it doesn't seem to me that those results necessarily follow or are borne out by the analysis here. It seems to me logically possible that someone could stop and think with all the amplitude that she's describing and not come out with conclusions that I would feel accord with pluralistic values or consideration for others. And likewise, someone could be a bureaucrat, functionary, or what have you, functioning and acting in a way that is actually ameliorating the lives of people, but doing so unthinkingly. And so I wonder about this, what seems to be this premise, this implicit premise that, you're gonna, if you stop and think and do the analysis, I don't want to turn it back to Trump, but to go back to Bob's point before, someone could engage in serious I and we thinking and come out with the kinds of results of the policies and views that indeed this administration is putting forward. So I wonder about that. And
yeah, Arendt doesn't, it's not a foolproof claim. I think it's it's a claim on what it means to be and accountable and thoughtful person in the world, which is part of what it means to be human. At the end of, the origins of totalitarianism is, the 697-page tome that's essentially 3 books in one. And she takes you through this, incredible journey to get to the last 10 pages, which are all about loneliness. And they're about loneliness and under the conditions of totalitarianism, because loneliness, which is in part bred by tyranny and fascism and fear and violence and bureaucracy and power and totalitarianism, does not allow us to think. We can't think when we're lonely, right? And when we're lonely, we're incredibly susceptible to ideological rhetoric and to political rhetoric, which offers us a place in the world, a sense of meaning through simplified explanations that offer accounts of why things are the way they are. We do see Donald Trump doing that in a lot of his, if you look at his political campaign speeches, he's very artfully talking about, I'm being a little facetious, but talking about, immigrants and the Mexicans in a way rhetorically that gives many Americans a sense of meaning because they feel displaced by American politics. He does it through other rhetorical devices as well. But what makes us susceptible to these kinds of movements, to these kinds of leaders, to these kinds of mass politics? So thinking is it's doing so much work in Arendt's writing. There's no guarantee that a very thoughtful person is not going to become a sociopath or mass murderer or engage in horrific behavior. But at the end of the day, what is it that we as individuals can do to take moral responsibility for our participation in the world, for our worldly existence, for ourselves as persons? And for her, it's to simply stop and think what we're doing, and to do it in a critical and reflective way, so that we're not just carried away by the tide of popular voice or opinion, but so that we can develop ourselves as individuals into active citizens and members of the world that we share in common, so that we can care for the human condition instead of just destroying it. And I think it's a very powerful idea. I don't think it's a cure-all. I think we could use a little more thinking today in a lot of respects, but it's also not easy, and I think it can be a kind of frustrating concept. There's a number of questions in the box, and we're running low on time, so I'm going to skip over here. Melissa said, a lot of what Arendt has written in is now being played out in press freedom crampdowns in China. I haven't been following this closely, so I can't say a lot about it. The very next day after the widow of Nobel Peace Prize award winner was passed away in detention last year, was set free. Kim Young-min was sentenced to 13 years imprisonment simply because he is a well-known citizen journalist, and people in China are generally conformist. I can't speak to that really much at all. I don't know much about Chinese politics or society. Regarding as if speaking to a brick wall. China, although great to trade with and loyal friends to me, the Chinese government is closer to the banality of evil more so than Trump toward Chinese nationals who do not comply. That's a really interesting point, Melissa. I really have no kind of ground to respond to that directly. If you want to say something. I'm going to keep going then. Susan Tucker wrote, Hannah Arendt's discussion of inability to think in criminal intent or motive, but a fundamental legal principle in criminal law is that we are presumed to intend the logical, rational consequences of our acts. So I didn't realize, I didn't think is not defense, which is not what Hannah Arendt is saying. But then I'm still stuck on the meaning and significance of someone who doesn't or can't think, especially in the sense of imagining the other's experience. Isn't this a definition of a sociopath? So I think this directly responds to what we were just talking about, Susan, in the terms of how Arendt is thinking about what it means to stop and think. I don't know if Eichmann was a sociopath. I think a sociopath technically is somebody who is incapable of feeling anything, in a certain sense, but I'm not sure. Melissa again wrote, in Australia, laws changed whereby no government officials can be individually prosecuted. They can hide behind bureaucracy. Only the entire department, which then becomes impossible for the vulnerable, who Arendt sees as alone and powerless of society, with such a power imbalance. Are you Susan Tucker? Here, how is Eichmann not a sociopath? The hiding behind bureaucratic red tape and instruction is now being repeated with the new changes in government department liability, like as with the Milgram experiments, also Susan Oberman. Melissa or Susan, do you want to, or Susan Tucker, Susan Oberman, do you want to jump in there and say something? Should I keep pressing us forward? I think the question of bureaucracy, I'm not familiar with Australian politics either. This is what happens when you spend all your time studying American politics and German politics and Hannah Arendt. So I wish I could offer something more on that. But I think there's a lot still to be said about bureaucracy. But Bob wrote, Arendt may talk about comedy, but nowhere in her work do I find anything funny. All right, so we're gonna have to we're not gonna escape this conversation. Ironic, certainly, but funny. Her ideas of funny seems to come out of that very slim volume German idea of comedy. You wrote that to be funny, right, Bob? Yes? Okay. I just want to check. Well done. It's a serious conversation. How is it, the fundamental question of how one tries to reckon with an event like the phenomenal appearance of totalitarianism is, I think, really important stylistically and historically. And it's a question that Arendt took very seriously. Her way of writing was not ill-considered. It was very thoughtful. And a lot of people disagree with it. Joanna wrote, another dimension regarding Susan's comment is that what it meant to be German does not presuppose a homogeneous group of people. My mother, for example, was ridiculed as not looking like a German. To be German, even in Hitler's time, was narrowly defined, and my family was not into being compliant. In fact, they considered themselves German, and that meant having a moral center. That meant not being obedient. I have a great respect for Arendt, but she might have thought about all the Germans that did not comply. I don't think that she's saying all Germans, but that German society on par, there's a stereotype that Germans do act in this way. But I take your point, Joanna. Melissa writes, it encourages us to think and not feel superior. To think and not feel superior. There are two ways to read that, which is both are interesting. Have some empathy and take a stand point of view to gain an understanding into ill thought out actions. In criminal law, defense law, for example, this is an equalizer and total awareness of the need to stop and think. Any person in the same circumstances may do the same. Margaret is right. The stage is set in politics in many senses. Leaders can create a sense of loss, yes, to create a yearning to belong. I think also Melissa down here, you're just you're responding. I don't know if you want to say anything, Melissa. Do you want to say something? So I think the point that it encourages us to think and not feel superior is really important to how Arendt is talking about why she chose to write about Eichmann in the way that she wrote about Eichmann. One thing I was teaching some of the Marx lectures last night for a course I'm doing on this book right now in the city, and one of the things that she talks about there that we did a few weeks ago in our reading group is this dichotomy in traditional Western political philosophy between the mind and the body. And one of her primary criticisms of Marx was that he reduced the political activity back to the body. This is also, again, why Arendt's writing can be held up in contrast to Foucault, who posits everything back into the body. Whereas Arendt continuously turns us back to rationality and to thinking as a critical capacity, as the work of philosophy and the work of political philosophy specifically. So, I mean, she seems brusque in this essay saying, look, yeah, I know I hurt people, but, it's about making an argument. It's not about trying to satisfy anyone's feelings, because it's about trying to make the best possible argument that one can make to support their claim in that kind of traditional sense, which again is very controversial, especially in, I think, our political climate today. You wrote to know thyself. Yes. Nietzsche's question. Howard wrote, the process does not end with individual thought. Once the thinking is done, the political requirement is discussing the thinking with others and rethinking. Absolutely, Howard. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, but I think towards the beginning when I was walking us through the essay and thinking about Arendt's approach to evil and how it changed throughout her writing over time, it's very clear that in her own thinking and in her own philosophical and theoretical methodology that she was always coming back to and returning to certain questions and concepts and categories. I actually think that's one of the reasons why this volume is so beautifully done. The idea of thinking without a banister is a concept that goes throughout all of the essays in here and what it means to think. And we really, in reading this together, get a chance to see how some of those key concepts and categories of Arendt's that underpin so much of her published books, The Human Condition and Eichmann and so on, and essays, develop over time. One of my favorite quotes from Arendt actually is entirely unpublished, and it comes from fragments in a lecture she gave in 1956 on the human condition when she was teaching it at the University of Chicago while she was writing the book. And she says that the work of political theorists and philosophers is the work of concepts. So one example that we've talked about before is, Hobbes. Hobbes develops a philosophy of domination, right? For Machiavelli, it's revolution. But concepts and categories, she says, are not fixed things. They're never the end of thought. They're always the beginning of thought. They're well springs from which we begin. And so I think that idea of how one does political theory, how one approaches the question of evil, which she's doing in the Eichmann book and in this interview in a certain way, and other things, for her is even a question of plurality, right? It's never fixed. It's never held still. It's always evolving and moving. And yes. So we are over time. Thank you so much. This was a really nice discussion. I just want to say as we sign off that I appreciate the pushback against Arendt's ideas, and I kind of view when I put on my kind of professorly hat and do this, that, you know, I'm giving you not necessarily my personal thoughts and opinions, but you know, trying to keep the, you know, the teaching of the Arendt. And I think a lot of the things that we, you know, talked about today, and a lot of things that come through this essay, are some of the more challenging aspects of Arendt's writing, that people who study her work are constantly, you know, wrestling with and trying to unpack. And it's one of the elements that makes her such a rich thinker, I think. So thank you so much. And we are going to resume on September 14th. So you have a long vacation from Roger and me. And then on September 14th, we will talk about freedom in politics, the essay. But I hope that everyone has a great July and enjoys the rest of the summer. And I hope that I see you soon. I'm sorry if I've been slow on email with some of you, but please feel free to write to me as you continue to read Thinking Without a Banister throughout the summer. And please sign up for our fall conference, which will be on October 11th and 12th at Bard, on citizenship and civil disobedience. The registration is open, and I hope to see you in person in October. So, okay, that's it. Have a good Friday. Thank you.
Sam, thank you, everybody.